recording started. So again, welcome to the Antrea community meeting. Today is Monday, September 28th or Tuesday, September 29th, if you are already past midnight. And for today in the agenda, we have two topics proposed by Antonin. The first one is about using the CLI for querying and using existing API and do the work client side, or introduce a public API which does all the work server side. And the link to the corresponding issue on GitHub is issue number 1137, and the link has been posted on the Zoom chat. So Antonin, would you like a little bit to discuss a little bit more about this?
Yes. I think both items are going to be pretty quick. Let's see, let me share my screen. You did share the link as well, but just in case. Maybe people remember actually 1 or 2 months ago, Jake was working at VMware for the summer, worked on a project called the NCTL query, where the objective was to be able to query the set of network policies which affect a given endpoint in the cluster, where a endpoint is basically a pod at this stage. And so Jake added support by the end of his internship. And right now, the way this is implemented is there is an HTTP endpoint exposed by the Antrea controller, and it's being queried by NCTL. And the way we do the implementation is we basically leverage the internal state from the Antrea controller to look up to look up all the policies which are either applied to a pod, the pod that's provided as an argument to NCTL query, or which select the pod in one of their ingress or egress rules. And so that's basically the stage of the implementation right now. It was shipped in Antrea v0.10. And the way to use it right now is you have to exec into the pod, which is running the Antrea controller, and you have to use encurl from inside that pod. And the rationale for that is that right now, encurl doesn't support, for this API at least, it doesn't support connecting remotely to the Antrea controller and handling like HTTPS authentication. So basically, the only way to use this functionality right now is to first exec into the Antrea controller pod. What I wanted to do, and I opened that issue about a month ago, was I wanted to check if we could support the same functionality when running NCTL outside of the cluster, just like we do for other NCTL commands that can be run outside of the cluster, where you just provide the kube config, and it either connects to the API server or it connects to the Antrea controller APIs, and you can run commands like this instead of having to exec into the Antrea controller pod. And so I was discussing with Chan what would be the best way to do it, and we kind of came up with like a workaround to be able to do that and handle HTTPS. Handle HTTPS by using the certificate published by the Antrea controller. And then Chan came up with like a suggestion, which was, because of how this functionality is implemented in the Antrea controller, where we basically use, well, if I were to give a quick example, if I give you a pod and you want to give me the policies which are applied to this pod, first you're going to look for the applied to groups, which are computed by the Antrea controller to which this pod belong, and then you're going to iterate over those applied to groups and basically retrieve the network policy from that. And so we use the state which is computed by the Antrea controllers there. What Chen suggested was that we could kind of like refactor the current NCTL query endpoint implementation so that instead of using a new API, which is like dedicated to that functionality, we could use existing APIs and basically just query apply to groups and address groups and network policy, query the contents of those stores and do all the implementation on the client side. This way we don't need to implement new we don't need to define new APIs and worry about having to version those APIs. Basically, we just leverage the existing internal APIs to retrieve all the state we need to do the computation. And so I wanted to bring this up at the community meeting because basically I'm looking for feedback about whether people think this is a good approach, and maybe this goes beyond just this specific use case and this specific API, or if people think that that kind of API that can let you kind of inspect the state of your cluster, inspect the state of the network policies, instead should be its own dedicated public API that other components beyond just NCL may want to leverage. You could imagine like an integration with another service which is providing some kind of UI for Antrea network policies. Maybe that's developed by someone else outside of the Antrea project. Well, that could be like an interesting API for them to be able to use, because ideally for integrations, people would not be relying on the internal Antrea APIs. Now, if we think the only use case is NCTL, well, maybe it makes sense in that scenario to use the internal APIs and implement all the functionality for NCTL query endpoint directly in NCTL on the client side, instead of introducing new APIs and having to worry about maintaining them. So hopefully that kind of made sense. And it's kind of like a bigger picture of just NCTL query endpoint. It's more about in the future, we may introduce additional functionality like this one, and we may have to make the decision multiple times of whether to use internal APIs and implement some client-side functionality in NCTL, or building a dedicated API that can be consumed easily for integrations by other clients.
Antoine, I only have one question regarding the comment from Chan here that we see here on the screen. Why do we think that none of the existing groups is suitable for this new API and we will need a new group?
So it's kind of like a question that keeps coming up. Basically, Chan and I thought that OPS would be a good group because I think that's where we define. Is it traceflow? I think traceflow is in ops, I think. But yes. Basically, what Chan brought up earlier is that on several occasions, I think, is that when you have an API group, you can either use it for CRDs or you can use it as an API service using the aggregation layer. And so in that case, a CRD wasn't really appropriate. And so, but because the ops API group already uses CRDs, you cannot mix the two in one API group, kind of like an API service and CRDs. And basically, we looked at all the existing API groups that we have. I think the only one that we could use was system, if I remember correctly, and I don't think system is like very appropriate for that functionality. Does that make sense, Salvatore?
Yes, makes total sense. Thank you for the clarification.
So it was kind of a bit of a heavy presentation. So if people don't have like comments right now and they want to comment on the issue later, I would appreciate that as well.
You know, my comment is very simple. Is that ideally, I would like to keep always clients as light as possible, and have as much logic as possible on the server side, mostly for the reason that you mentioned, is that you can never know these APIs can be reused in some other context which is not in ANSTL, Ankara, oh sorry, I cannot pronounce that, and so I'm thinking of a good reason for not doing it on the server side. So let's put it in this way. Is there any good reason, apart from what you mentioned of not having to maintain a new API, for not doing it on the server side and keeping it on the client?
Chan can correct me, but I think the only reason was really to avoid introducing a new API. I mean, at least that's my understanding.
Got it.
Yeah. But still, the API is a little similar to the existing ones, like policies, right? Because it still queries the network policy API just with some port as a condition, right? It's just like the agent side API that we use get network policy, and we have an option to specify the related port and only get the related ports. It's also in the same network policy API in the API server or for agent. So maybe if we want a new API, maybe the internal control plane group could be the group. What do you think?
I think it depends on whether we see it as like an internal API or something that should be easily consumed publicly. Because I think we made it clear that control plane was supposed to be an internal API, and we may have like different backward compatibility guarantees and upgrade guarantees for that internal API as opposed to the other APIs. And like applied to groups, address groups, those are like kind of like concepts which are like specific to the Antrea implementation. So I don't know if I feel good about mixing the two in the same API group and using the internal API group for that.
But I find I know some commands of Ankato already use the control plane API, like the one.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Once again, I think if the scope is just Ankato as a client, then I think using internal APIs is fine. I think my question was also, do we think there's going to be a use for an API like this one for integration with other projects, in which case it's not just Ankato. Maybe you want to have like a public API that other components can consume.
Good point. At the moment, if you ask me, is there a use case? I would say, I don't know. The thing is that now there is no use case probably, but you can never know if in 3-4 months, 1 year, there will be a use case. So I will say probably the problem can be we can look at it from an effort perspective. Is it worth doing now the effort for adding a new API, or might it be better to defer this effort and maybe re-implement the feature on the server side in second stage? So that mostly it's a question that I cannot answer, and I don't know what you think. Because if you tell me that implementing this on the server side will require a significant additional effort, then maybe it is better if we say, okay, we do that when we have a concrete use case for some other client consuming it. But if pretty much is the same effort, then I will just go straight and implement it on the server side with an API.
So it's already on the server side. The question was about whether we should move it to the client side.
Okay.
I kind of, yeah.
Sorry.
I kind of like Chan's idea of maybe putting it in the control plane API right now, as Ankato is the only consumer, and And if we see a use case down the line where it needs to be moved to a public API group, then I can move it. We can move it to a public API group.
So I kind of joined late. Probably I didn't catch all the discussion, but I just want to add one point. I think that even this control plane API, it's not really internal. I would say it's also public API, and we also register to Kubernetes API as an API service, I believe.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So at least I don't view it's internal only. I would say potentially there can be other client consume the API too.
I thought internal was our favorite name for it.
That is true.
But yeah, I mean, I like that plan. I'll see if I can use a control plane API right now, given that NCTL is the only consumer. And if someone comes and say, I want to use that, maybe we'll consider moving it to a different API group. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Sounds good to me.
So while I'm sharing my screen, should I cover the second item, Salvatore?
Yes, please go ahead. Also, because we don't have any other item proposed for today, at least not on the Slack channel. So the second item is about generating documentation for Antrea public APIs and CRDs, and the reference PR is the one that Antonin is on the screen and that I'm sharing on the chat. Please go ahead, Antonin.
Thanks. So that's something I'm working on in the background right now. People may have noticed, but a couple months ago, and I think that was actually suggested by Stephen Wong, who's I think is on the call. I started the process of trying to get a passing CII badge for Antrea. CII stands for a Core Infrastructure Initiative. And the way you do that is there is kind of like a self-service form that you fill, and it's a Linux Foundation initiative, and basically it shows people that you're trying to follow the best practices when it comes to open source software. And I think the idea is that by filling the form, it also kind of like a checklist for you as a project maintainer to see if your project is following best practices, and probably make adjustments to your project as you go. And so
a couple
I made some
other things. Can I go in?
Of course.
The other reason for doing this is that if you apply to get into the CNCF for sponsorship, I think citing this as the deck that you'd submit for consideration by the voting members is something that would be helpful. Also, the process is just useful to kind of put you on a glide path to be a well-run open source project. And I think potentially some of the users who might adopt a project would use this and be impressed. Maybe the tiebreaker for choosing this as a CNI versus a different one is that this one has the badge of certification.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Those are all good points. And so I've been working on like basically getting all the check boxes there on that form for the last 2 months or so. And most of those were like either we already met, or it was like a pretty small change in the Antrea code base or repository in documentation to meet it. And at that stage, there is only one strict requirement that we are not meeting. It's to provide reference documentation to describe the external interfaces of the software. And so if you look at a project like Kubernetes, for example, they do have like automatically generated like documentation for the REST APIs that you can check online. I think, do I have the link here in the issue? I don't think I do, but it's pretty easy to oh, it's here, sorry. So those are the generated APIs for the latest version of Kubernetes 1.19. And so basically the way they do it in Kubernetes, if I recall correctly, is they use the Go declaration of types, and then they generate actually that generate like an open API specification, swagger.json, by running an instance of the API server and connecting to it and collecting all the open API specifications from the running API. And once they get that swagger.json file, they run like a custom script and they end up with the website I was just showing. And so, well, I just wanted people to be aware of that effort here. I guess both the CII initiative, for which we're trying to get a badge, like Steve described, and the fact that this is the last remaining piece of the puzzle before we can get the passing badge. And if anyone has like good ideas as to how we can generate the documentation. And initially I was like considering only generating the documentation for our CRDs. But as Janjun pointed out, like the so-called internal API control plane maybe should be documented as well, because other entry integrations may actually end up consuming that API directly. So I wasn't exactly sure what the best way of generating documentation uniformly for both our CRDs and our API services. Because I kind of like for API services, I think you can kind of use like the Kubernetes way of running like an instance of your API server. But for CRDs, there seems to be like another project which is like simpler to use. So basically, I'm still looking for the right approach on how I can generate that documentation. So if anyone has like any feedback, any idea, or has done this before, I think that would be appreciated. And feel free to comment on the issue. And by the way, as part of this change, yeah, we may need to like improve the documentation in our Go API declarations to add more comments and make sure the auto-generated documentation makes sense for users and developers.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any other comment or question on this effort? Seems not. All right. So it appears that we have exhausted the topics that we had on the agenda for today. So this is a rare occasion where it seems that we are headed for a short meeting. So is there anything else that you would like to bring up for discussion for today? I'll wait a couple of minutes to see if there is any other proposed topic.
I think we're good. Did you fall asleep, Salvatore?
No. I'm still here, and unfortunately, I cannot afford to fall asleep. At least not for the next 16 hours. So 18 hours. So yep, it's anyway. So I think it's all for today. I would like to thank everyone as usual for attending. It's been a very good conversation, and so before we close the meeting, just a quick update on the release schedule. So what is the next Antrea release expected?
Let me double check, but it's at the beginning of November, and the idea is to have it right before KubeCon. Currently, it's scheduled for November 4th, I think. But we may be okay with postponing it a bit, because I know that we have an upcoming Chinese holiday, and so it may impact our development.
That is correct. So in terms of meeting scheduling, the Chinese national holiday should not impact our community meeting much because thanks to the shift that we did for Labor Day, we are also in a good shape for this Chinese holiday. Indeed, the next instance of the meeting should be on October 13th, which is right when people in China should come back to work. So on that front, we should be good. And well, and then thanks everyone for attending, and I wish everyone a good night, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening.
Thanks, Salvatore, and congrats everyone on the 0.10 release.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.